The British Empire began not as a grand design, but as a series of commercial ventures and strategic acquisitions that would eventually span the globe. The foundation was laid in 1600 with the establishment of the East India Company, granted a royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I to trade in the East Indies. This marked the beginning of Britain's transformation from a relatively small island nation into the world's dominant imperial power. The early 17th century saw the establishment of Britain's first permanent colonies in North America. Jamestown, founded in 1607, became the first successful English settlement in Virginia, followed by the Plymouth colony in 1620. These early settlements were driven by a combination of economic opportunity, religious freedom, and the desire to compete with Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires that had already established footholds in the Americas. The Caribbean proved equally important to British expansion. Islands like Barbados and Jamaica became crucial sugar-producing colonies, establishing patterns of plantation agriculture that would shape British colonial policy for centuries. The profitable sugar trade created immense wealth for British merchants and planters, while simultaneously driving the expansion of the Atlantic slave trade. During this period, Britain also established trading posts and factories in India, competing with Dutch, Portuguese, and French interests. The East India Company gradually expanded its presence from coastal trading posts to inland territories, setting the stage for eventual British dominance over the subcontinent. The 18th century witnessed the British Empire's emergence as a global power through a series of conflicts with European rivals, particularly France and Spain. The 7 Years' War proved pivotal, with British victories in North America, the Caribbean, and India fundamentally altering the global balance of power. The Treaty of Paris confirmed Britain's dominance, granting it control over French Canada and establishing British supremacy in North America east of the Mississippi River. In India, Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey marked the beginning of British political control over Bengal, transforming the East India Company from a trading organization into a territorial power. This period saw the development of mercantilism as the dominant economic philosophy governing British colonial policy. Colonies were expected to provide raw materials to Britain while purchasing manufactured goods in return, creating a system designed to maximize British wealth and power. The Navigation Acts enforced this system, requiring colonial trade to flow through British ports and ships. However, the very success of this system created tensions that would ultimately lead to the loss of Britain's most valuable colonies. The American Revolution fundamentally challenged British imperial authority, with the 13 colonies declaring independence and fighting a successful war of liberation. The loss of the American colonies forced Britain to reconsider its imperial strategy and methods of governance. The loss of the American colonies initially appeared catastrophic, but Britain quickly adapted, developing what historians call the Second Empire. This phase was characterized by different approaches to colonial governance and the integration of imperial expansion with the Industrial Revolution. The exploration and settlement of Australia began with the first fleet's arrival in 1788, establishing a penal colony that would eventually become a thriving settler society. Captain James Cook's voyages in the Pacific had revealed new territories for potential colonization, and Australia provided both a solution to prison overcrowding and new opportunities for British expansion. The policy of subsidiary alliances developed by Lord Wellesley extended British influence over Indian princely states without direct annexation. In India, the British continued their gradual expansion of control. However, the Indian Rebellion of 1857 marked a turning point. The brutal suppression of this uprising led to the Government of India Act 1858, which transferred control of India from the East India Company to the British Crown. Abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire in 1833 represented a significant moral and economic shift. This decision, driven by evangelical Christian movements and changing economic conditions, demonstrated Britain's evolving relationship with its colonies and growing confidence in free trade principles. Free trade increasingly replaced mercantilism as the dominant economic philosophy. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 and the Navigation Acts in 1849 reflected Britain's confidence in its industrial superiority and its ability to compete in open markets. This shift coincided with the concept of informal empire, where British economic and political influence extended beyond formal territorial control. The late 19th century marked the zenith of British imperial power, often referred to as the Imperial High Tide. This period saw unprecedented territorial expansion, the development of imperial ideology, and the integration of empire into British national identity. The scramble for Africa exemplified this expansionist phase. British involvement in Egypt following the Suez Crisis of 1882 demonstrated the empire as global reach and strategic concerns. The construction of the Suez Canal had made the route to India crucial to British interests, leading to increasing involvement in Middle Eastern and African affairs. Cecil Rhodes embodied the imperial spirit of this era, envisioning British control from Cape to Cairo. His activities in southern Africa, including the establishment of Rhodesia, reflected the combination of personal ambition, commercial interests, and imperial ideology that drove expansion during this period. The Indian Empire reached its greatest extent during this era with the proclamation of Queen Victoria as Empress of India in 1877, symbolizing the importance of the subcontinent to British identity and power. The construction of railways, telegraph lines, and administrative systems integrated India into the global British system while simultaneously creating the infrastructure that would later facilitate independence movements. Imperial ideology reached its peak during this period, with concepts of racial superiority, the civilizing mission, and Britain's destiny to rule widely accepted among the British public. The celebration of Empire Day and the popularity of imperial literature reflected the extent to which empire had become central to British national identity. The First World War marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire, though this was not immediately apparent. While the war demonstrated the empire's ability to mobilize resources on a global scale, it also revealed the limitations of British power and the growing strength of imperial subjects. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa made significant contributions to the war effort, but their sacrifice led to demands for greater autonomy. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 and the Statute of Westminster in 1931 granted these territories dominion status, effectively recognizing their independence while maintaining symbolic ties to the Crown. In Ireland, the Easter Rising of 1916 and subsequent War of Independence led to the partition of Ireland and the Tuath Island and the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922. This represented the first major territorial loss in the British Isles since the American Revolution and demonstrated the power of nationalist movements within the empire. The interwar period saw growing challenges to British rule throughout the empire. In India, Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent resistance movement gained widespread support, while in the Middle East, mandates in Palestine and Iraq created new problems for British administrators. The economic strains of the Great Depression further weakened Britain's ability to maintain its global empire. The Second World War accelerated imperial decline despite ultimate victory. The fall of Singapore in 1942 shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia, while the need for American support demonstrated Britain's reduced global position. The war's enormous cost left Britain financially exhausted and dependent on American aid, making it increasingly difficult to maintain imperial commitments. The post-war period witnessed the rapid dissolution of the British Empire through a process of decolonization that was sometimes peaceful and sometimes violent. The independence of India and Pakistan in 1947 marked the end of the jewel in the crown and set the pattern for subsequent decolonization. The partition of British India into India and Pakistan was accompanied by massive population movements and communal violence that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The handling of partition demonstrated both the limitations of British planning and the complex legacy of imperial rule in religiously and ethnically diverse societies. In Africa, the process of decolonization varied significantly. The Gold Coast became independent as Ghana in 1957, setting a precedent for peaceful transition. However, the Momo uprising in Kenya and the prolonged crisis in southern Rhodesia demonstrated that decolonization could be violent and contested. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked a decisive moment in the decline of British power. The failed attempt to reassert control over the Suez Canal, opposed by both the United States and Soviet Union, demonstrated that Britain could no longer act as a global power without American support. By the 1960s, the wind of change identified by Prime Minister Harold Macmillan had transformed the empire into the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of former colonies. Most territories gained independence peacefully, though problems persisted in areas like Northern Ireland, the Falklands, and various Caribbean territories. The transfer of Hong Kong to China in 1997 marked the symbolic end of the British Empire, though several small overseas territories remain under British control. The British Empire's legacy remains complex and contested. At its height, it encompassed approximately 25% of the world's land surface and population, making it the largest empire in human history. The empire spread English language, legal systems, and parliamentary democracy across the globe, while also facilitating unprecedented levels of global trade and communication. However, this legacy must be balanced against the empire's role in slavery, economic exploitation, and cultural disruption. The empire's impact on indigenous peoples was often devastating, while its economic policies frequently prioritized British interests over colonial welfare. The empire's contribution to global development remains debated. While imperial infrastructure and institutions provided foundations for modern states, the extractive nature of colonial economics often impeded indigenous development. The artificial borders created by imperial administrators continue to cause conflicts in many regions. Today, the British Empire is remembered differently across the former colonies and in Britain itself. While some celebrate the spread of democracy and rule of law, others emphasize the violence and exploitation that characterized imperial rule. This ongoing debate reflects the empire's profound and lasting impact on global history. The transformation of empire into commonwealth represents an attempt to maintain beneficial relationships while acknowledging the end of imperial control. Though the Commonwealth has limited political significance, it serves as a reminder of historical connections and shared experiences that continue to shape international relations. The British Empire's economic influence extended far beyond political control, fundamentally reshaping global trade patterns and economic structures. The empire created the world's first truly global economy, with London serving as the financial capital coordinating trade flows between continents. The pound sterling became the world's reserve currency, facilitating international commerce and investment on an unprecedented scale. Imperial economic policies had profound long-term consequences for former colonies. The emphasis on raw material extraction and agricultural production for export created economic structures that many post-colonial states struggled to diversify. The development of plantation economies in the Caribbean, tea and cotton production in India, and mining operations in Africa established patterns of economic dependence that persisted long after independence. Culturally, the empire facilitated the global spread of English language, literature, and educational systems. English became the lingua franca of international business and diplomacy, a position it maintains today. The empire also spread British legal traditions, with common law systems adopted across many former colonies, creating shared legal frameworks that continue to influence international law. The empire's cultural impact was reciprocal, with colonial influences profoundly shaping British society. Indian cuisine, Caribbean music, and African art became integral parts of British culture, while colonial experiences influenced British literature from Rudyard Kipling to George Orwell. This cultural exchange, though often occurring within unequal power relationships, created lasting connections between Britain and its former colonies. The British Empire's history ultimately demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of imperial power, serving as a crucial case study for understanding the dynamics of global dominance and the inevitable challenges that face all empires throughout history.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more engaging historical content.